Hi, good morning. This is Ed Aniff and Stacy Gimalis from Apogee, and today we're going to be talking about APIs and copyright, specifically what the recent news around Oracle and Google and the lawsuit around the use of the Java API means to API developers and people who are looking to provide APIs to developers. Just a quick backgrounder. I'll let Stacy do her introduction.
I'm Stacy Gimalis. I'm the legal function leader for Apogee.
And I'm Ed Aniff. I lead product strategy at Apogee and a longtime developer and user of APIs.
And the first thing we want to do is provide a little bit of context for this webinar and this discussion. We intended this for API users and API creators who are curious about the impact of the Oracle versus Google decision. This may be sort of individual developers. Some of you may be large enterprises that have your own business and legal departments. And so we're really just trying to educate folks on this decision. It's also not a critical legal analysis or a critical analysis of what the case, what could have been done better and the impact on other cases. And also, we don't intend this webinar as legal advice. That is where you apply a set of relevant laws, not just one case, to a specific set of facts. We won't be able to do that today. Moving on, a little bit of background on the case. Oracle sued Google in 2010 on both patent and copyright claims on the Java API. It didn't involve the implementing code that Google wrote to the Java API. 2012, the trial court said that the Java API was not copyrightable, meaning it's not subject to copyright. Oracle appealed that, and in 2014, the Federal Appeals Court, which is called the Federal Circuit Court in this case, decided that the Java API declaration headers and the overall structure, sequence, and organization of the Java API was protected by copyright. They reviewed the trial court's decision, decided that the trial court had made the wrong decision for the wrong reasons. And then recently, a month ago, the United States Supreme Court decided not to hear the Federal Appeals Court decision, which means that the Federal Appeals Court decision is now binding law in the Ninth Circuit, which includes most of the Western states.
So this has been interesting for people who've been following it because basically it's sort of ping-pong back and forth. First it was saying that they were not copyrightable, everybody celebrated, then it turns out that on appeal it is, and then and a lot of people were sitting around and waiting to see what the Supreme Court said on that, and then they chose not to hear it, which basically means that it's up to the lower courts. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, some of the issues were determined by the Federal Appeals Court. It's kind of the end of the line for that.
Yep.
But equally half of this issue, which is fair use, is, as we'll see, is gone back to the trial court. So some of it's final, some of it's not, and it has, yes, as you say, been a bit of a roller coaster.
Yep. So in terms of what this what this meant from the standpoint of copyright infringement, can you tell us a little bit about what are the elements of that? What does that mean for when people are trying to understand how copyright applies in things like APIs?
Yeah, and it's helpful to know here that very broadly, copyright infringement requires 3 elements, but only 2 of them were before the Federal Appeals Court. One of them is you need a work that's protected by copyright. In this case, the work is a software program, specifically the Java API. Second is infringement of the copyrighted work by copying it or distributing it. And third is there is no valid defense to infringement, such as fair use. What the Federal Circuit Court's decisions turned on was about whether the work was protected by copyright and whether Google had a fair use defense. On the first issue, which is the trial court had held that the Java API declaration headers were not protected by copyright, the Federal Circuit Court said no, the trial court got that wrong. The Java API declaration headers and also the structure, sequence, and organization were protected by copyright. The second issue is, did Google's use of the Java API constitute fair use? And the Federal Appeals Court said, we don't have enough information to decide, so the trial court needs to rehear that. So that's the sort of the half of this that's still pending. But the Federal Appeals Court did go ahead and make some comments on fair use, so we'll talk about that. I think it's still relevant for this discussion.
And so this is an interesting thing. So basically what it says is this is firmly within the domain of copyright law, is what was reaffirmed here, is essentially saying that it is copyrightable.
Absolutely. Now, it's a side note, but Oracle originally also sued Google on patent claims, on an Oracle patent, which was probably a Sun patent before that, related to the Java API, and I haven't actually dug into the reasons, but for whatever reason, that patent was either declared invalid or was declared that this Java API wasn't protected by it.
That makes sense.
So the patent claims fell away, which is actually a historical note why the Federal Circuit Court had this case instead of the Ninth Circuit.
Okay.
Because it was a patent claim originally. Talk about the facts of the case a little bit to give you some background. This is a little bit dry, but bear with us because it'll be important for the discussion that follows. The Java API is particularly complex and intricately organized. It's a code API, not a web API, and Ed, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, sure. So Java developers are going to be, intimately familiar with the contents of the Java API, because really any application that gets built on Java, for the most part, is going to be using the Java API. In fact, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to use the Java API when you're building a Java application in whatever form that might take. And it's a pretty expansive API. This is nothing new to Java developers, but Java was first made available in the 94-95 timeframe, and it's grown quite a bit over the years. It consists of a set of Java classes. I won't get off onto a tangent on object-oriented programming and what classes mean, but essentially they functions within Java organized into classes, each of which has a number of methods. While Java has a large amount of classes, specifically for this case, it only included about 37 of them. And while that might seem like a small set of classes compared to sort of the overall around 600 classes that are part of Java, these were the core classes, what are called the Java lang classes, which are the Java language classes. Really sort of the basic functionality that goes into Java, how you actually deal with fundamental data types, and how you interact with the system. So these really are sort of the starting point for trying to build a system that a Java developer would recognize and be able to immediately make use of. And in Android, Google basically used these 37 classes, the declaration headers of those, pretty much as is, and they admitted to that.
They copied it exactly, actually.
Yep. So that's kind of the code base that was in question. And this is different than a web API. Web APIs, in Java, the APIs and the code that implements those APIs gets mixed together. They can be separated out. It's interesting, some of the legal language used terms like declaration headers, which Java actually doesn't separate out the headers from the code like other languages do, but they still, I think for the purposes of explaining this and perhaps in leveraging previous case law, they both Google and Oracle seem to use that terminology a lot. That might have just been to make it easier to do apples to apples to some of the previous.
Great, and we've got some slides later on getting at a little bit more of the differences.
Yep.
I think we should also point out that, as Ed mentioned, the specific, just that the fact that the Java API is so complicated and intricately organized was very important in the Federal Appeals Court decision. As Ed noted, it's 6,000 methods. They're combined with variables and then grouped into subclasses, which are grouped into classes, and then the 600 classes are combined with interfaces and grouped into 166 API packages. Actually, I think it's more, it might be 168. The Federal Appeals Court decision noted that the Java API is like a library where there's 166 or 168 shelves, which are the packages. There are books on the shelves, which are the classes, and there are chapters in the book, which is the routine. So there was quite a bit of hierarchy.
Yeah, and the fact that they were all identical. We'll get into a little bit more about what this means in a little bit, but oftentimes developers come and say to me, well, what if I accidentally name something the same way? This case was well beyond that. There was nothing accidental about that. These, in fact, were intentionally named exactly the same way.
Yeah, intentionally is a good word.
Yeah, and freely admitted intention. That was not, there was no, there were no claims or anything where Google said, whoops, somehow. We don't know how
Google said,
they...
no, I copied it, but it's not the subject of a copyright, and by the way, I have fair use. And before we continue on with the facts, could we, for the non-technical people in the audience, talk about what an API is generically? Yeah, we probably should have started off with that. An API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a term that arose in the early days of computer science when people started to separate out the code that is developed by an application developer from the code that is part of a platform. In this case, Java is a platform, and people are building applications on top of it that leverage capabilities that Java exposes. These capabilities might be interfacing with the file system, they might be communicating with the network, they might be user interface functionality, but when you build your Java application, it uses this interface, hence the application programming interface term, to communicate with the Java platform to make use of these capabilities. And so this has a lot of importance, and this is actually what we talk about in this next slide for two different reasons. One is for the purpose of compatibility, because by allowing an application to be compatible with multiple suppliers of a platform, those platforms need to speak the same interface. So you often see APIs and API compatibility being a big deal. It's what allows you to have for example, on Windows, you can run an application on all the different versions of Windows, whether it's like Windows NT or Windows 8, because the API is compatible. That's a case where that's a platform coming from a single vendor. But in the Unix world, and where you've got different flavors of Unix and you've got Linux and so on, those are all platforms that speak the same API, even though they're built and supplied by different groups of developers or different vendors, but API compatibility is a goal from all of these, and that's why your applications can run on a number of these different computers. Java itself has this concept of write once, run anywhere, and the Java license is, for the most part, this is one of the things that Sun and then Oracle have both sought to mandate, has been that if you want to go and say something is Java and you want to go and use this Java API, that you have to enforce compatibility, because write once, run anywhere means that every one of these platforms is compatible. And this was also, there was a famous suit between and settlement between Microsoft and Sun way back in the day, that was with the Microsoft version of Java, where Microsoft was breaking compatibility. So it's something that Sun historically took very seriously, and Oracle, for a number of reasons, some interested in maintaining the Java platform, and some of them, frankly, very clear business interests. Which is always important.
Which is always very important. Were also brought into bear here.
Great, and we should note one of the facts of the case that was noted by the Federal Circuit Court is that there was licensing conversations between Sun and Google about licensing the Java API for use in Android OS. But those conversations broke down because Google refused to follow the Java core standard of write once, run anywhere, which means that Android OS apps do not run on other Java-based platforms.
Correct. Basically, what Google wanted in relation to Java was to be able to have their cake and eat it too, which was that they wanted developers to be able to have a familiar API that they had spent, a large number of developers were very familiar with. Java is still one of the, if not the most widely taught, widely known programming languages out there. Just a tremendous amount of developers worldwide are familiar with Java. And Google wanted those developers to be able to get started very quickly on Android and be able to be productive on Android, because that's critical when you're rolling out a new platform, is that you've got this huge labor market of developers that can make use of it. But they really weren't interested in building compatibility. They weren't trying to be part of the Java ecosystem. They weren't particularly trying to make it easy for people to port things one way or another, and they certainly were not subscribing to the write once, run anywhere idea of Java. And I say this without a criticism of Google or Oracle in this point, but they very definitely had very different business goals.
Absolutely, and the Federal Circuit Court did point that out. So as you noted, also the first point on this slide, the Java API packages that Google incorporated into Android OS did not allow, into the Android API, did not allow the Android platform or the Android OS to access or interoperate with the Java platform.
Correct.
Okay, so the Federal Circuit Court made several holdings that are relevant for our discussion. One, that the Java API declaration headers are copyrightable. And you'll want to remember that the Federal Circuit Court was reviewing the Trial Circuit Court's decision. So not every argument that had been made was before the Federal Circuit Court. Just the holdings that the trial court had relied upon in the trial court making its decision were in front of the Federal Circuit Court. So the trial court had said, hey, there's idea expression merger, which is present when there's only one or only a few ways to write something for the declaration headers. For legalistic reasons based on Ninth Circuit law, the Federal Circuit Court said, no, that's wrong. In the Ninth Circuit, idea expression merger is only for a defense against infringement. It's not relevant for whether the Java API is protected by copyright. The Federal Circuit Court did go on to say, though, that idea expression merger was not present here. They named a possible exception, which is there are three of the 37 were what they called core API packages, which were necessary for an app developer to make any use whatsoever of Java. And they said, hey, it's not in front of us. Google didn't argue it that way, but those three core packages may be, merger may be present for those, so they may not be protected by copyright. The Federal Circuit Court also noted that Google, in deciding that merger did apply to the other declaration headers, they noted that Google could have written its own declaring code and just used the Java routine name. They specifically called out here java.lang.math.max for the max routine. And they could have written their own declaring code and just used the routine name to invoke that Java operation, which illustrated that there was merger didn't apply because there was a number of different ways to write it. They also noted, for example, that Sun could have written those declaration headers differently. And here declaration headers kind of merged with routine names in the Federal Circuit Court's decision. But the Federal Circuit Court gave the example that the math.max, where math is the class and max is the name of the routine, they could have called it math.maximum or arith.larger. So that illustrates in the Federal Circuit Court's decision, in their reasoning, that idea expression merger is not present.
Yeah. So this is really interesting because a lot of the criticism I hear from people is that this stuff is being argued by people who don't know anything about the technology or don't know anything about APIs and all of that.
Yes.
And that's something that developers, coders, certainly myself, we would like to believe that. But when I go and review all this stuff, I go and say, wow, they consulted a lot of experts and they got into a lot of sort of line by line detail using examples. And so this stuff this isn't people who are completely unaware of it trying to pass judgment on a discipline that they don't know. They obviously, both sides pulled in a lot of experts and got into some fairly thorough detail of talking about these types of scenarios, and the reason why they use these function names, of course, is because these are very sort of fundamental operations that you are going to perform in your software. And then what they were trying to prove here, I guess, was to go and say, even for these very basic operations, there were still different ways they could have been expressed.
Oh yeah, they definitely got into the nitty-gritty. If we were doing a critical analysis, I think this would actually be the one area where I personally would sort of want to pick at it and drill down into it, because I'm not sure about that. Earlier in the slides, we presented the declaration header, which is public, static, int, max.
Right.
And then, and public and static are ways of accessing information about how to access it. Int is what gets returned.
Yep.
And max is the name.
Yep.
I mean.
No, that's a very basic. And that's,
it's so basic.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Federal Circuit Court also discussed in its decision the fact that the trial court had talked about names and short phrases. It's actually, I think, called the Names and Short Phrases Doctrine. But there's regulations and Copyright Office regulations that say that words and short phrases that comprise names are not copyrightable. So in this case, max, for example, or math.max would not itself be copyrightable. But the Federal Circuit Court went on to say, hey, you've used all these names, it's a compilation of names like a database. And the federal trial court had already noted that it was a taxonomy and that there was creativity used in the selection and arrangement of the names. So that's why the Federal Circuit Court overturned that part of the trial court's decision. Then the second area that the Federal Circuit Court made holdings on was related to the structure, sequence, and organization of the Java API. They said that that is copyrightable. And the reason that's important here is because structure, sequence, and organization of a copyrighted work is not a literal element of the copyrighted work. And again, here we noted that Google had copied 7,000 lines of the Java API code. Literal copying was present. However, the Federal Circuit Court went on and reviewed the trial court's decision about the structure, sequence, and organization too. So they noted that the Java API is creative and original taxonomy. They talked about the intricate structure that we talked about earlier in the webinar. They noted that Google could have employed, or they can employ the general routine class package structure to offer the same functionality, but noted that it replicated the exact detailed arrangement of every single Java routine in those 37 API packages. So that's what was troubling for the Federal Circuit Court.
And again, it goes back to the fact that this was not sort of an accidental thing. And no one contested that. It was an intentional reusage.
Yeah, and then the Federal Circuit Court went ahead and made some comments on fair use, even though, as we said earlier, fair use, it sent back to the trial court and said we don't have enough information to decide that, so the fair use part of this case is still pending. But they noted that under Ninth Circuit law, the need to interoperate with a program is relevant to a fair use defense, not to copyrightability as the trial court had used it. But they went ahead and noted, and they were clearly troubled by this, that Google was not trying to make Android operating system compatible with the Java platform. Instead, as Ed noted, they wanted to accelerate availability of the Android OS, having apps available on the Android OS by leveraging the fact that developers were already trained and experienced in using Java to make it easy for them. And last, the court, in their commentary on fair use, noted 4 factors, which we're noting here because they are probably relevant for our ensuing discussion. There's 4 fair use factors, and they're applied on a case-by-case basis. The purpose and character of the infringing use, the nature of the copyrighted work, including how informative or functional it is versus how creative it is, and that's relevant for software programs, of course. The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion of the copyrighted work that was used or copied. And number 4, which they noted is by far the most important factor, is the effect of the use upon the value of or the market for the copyright holder's work. In this case, the effect of Java's copying, Google's copying of the Java API, the effect on the Java platform.
So let me ask you, I do have a little comment on that. So a couple of things. First, fair use is a defense.
Yes.
And so that's I think is one of the important things. That's the point that's being made here, is that this was commentary that said these are some of the considerations for the fair use discussion. But
It's like a sort of a flag or a set of considerations for the trial court to get
Exactly.
it right in the Federal Circuit's view, yes.
so if I were to simplify that a little bit, it's sort of, question one is Oracle saying, the Java API is copyrightable, and the first part of the argument being, no, it's not, and the answer being here, yes, it is, and that's what's been determined. The second piece of that is then presumably Google saying, okay, yes, it's copyrightable, but I'm using it in a fair use sort of way. And that hasn't been fully determined, although there's been some commentary that goes to say what that might look like. And part of this is going and saying, the effect of the use on the value of the market. And obviously, if we look at the modern mobile smartphone platform, there is for the most part a large and growing Android platform, and there isn't a similarly large and growing Java mobile platform happening, and so that gives you something to think about in terms of how.
No, that's right. Although the Federal Circuit Court did note that at the time that Google incorporated the Java API, Sun was licensing the Java API for use in the mobile market.
Absolutely.
It was not ultimately successful, but
Correct.
they had a competing offering.
Oh, yeah, no, correct.
Competing offering, if you will.
Yes, exactly. No, that was the point I was making,
Yeah.
is that actually there might be a challenge there with number 4, because to some degree the success of Android has been to the detriment
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
Java
And
mobile.
the Federal Circuit Court, there was a reason they said, hey, number 4 is by far the most important.
Yes.
They were clearly troubled by Google's reason for copying the Java API. So just to provide some comments and context, first starting with the comments and context on the decision, the Federal Circuit Court did not say that all APIs are copyrightable. They said it's case by case, you gotta look at each copyrighted work. They determined that the Java API specifically was copyrightable. And it's a very fact-specific decision, so it does not mean that all APIs are copyrightable. I think the reason, though, that this decision has gotten some attention is because I think there were many people before this who assumed that no APIs were copyrightable, so this was a bit of a splash of cold water. Also note that the Federal Circuit Court and the trial court and Google and Oracle, the Java API was considered as a separate copyrighted work, separate from the underlying Java platform, and they actually have separate licenses as well. So it's just an API in and of itself is considered a work that is potentially subject to copyright. And the case was not about implementing code that is written to an API. It's about copying the API itself. Google had written its own implementing code to write to the API. And the complicating factor here is that the purposes for which Google was copying the Java API was not to interoperate with the Java platform. So they weren't even really implementing the Java API as the Java API.
Correct.
They were writing implementing code to the Java API, which they were using for their own API. So the situational aspects.
Yeah, so I think when we look at this, the takeaway so first of all, I think part of the reason why people are getting frustrated by this is that most developers we sort of deal with, unless we're doing functional programming, we tend to deal with sort of binary, true or false types of statements. And so the answer of APIs on a case-by-case basis are copyrightable is not a very comforting answer on a lot of fronts. But some of the things that come into context here that explain why this might be different than other situations are some of the ones here, which is that Google explicitly cloned part of the Java API, but not for compatibility reasons. They did it in a way that was contrary to a lot of the core stated philosophy of Java, which, by the way, has been codified in the Java licensing. And this is not we talked a little bit about the whole Microsoft and Sun dust up from a few years back. So there's actually been some history here around the fact that the use of the Java license and the idea of technical compatibility and right ones run anywhere has been core aspects of how Java has been put out there and for what purpose it's been put out there. And so, what happened here was really a question of an interpretation of definitely the letter of the law in relation to the use of the Java API versus the spirit of it. And I think that that's part of why this kicked up this situation. The spirit of the Java API and the usage of the Java API has very much always been around compatibility and write once, run anywhere. And so that's part of how this situation ended up here. When I look at these, I go and say, well, a lot of the questions, most of us won't be in this particular situation.
Hopefully not.
There are this is, to put it simply, this is a battle of platforms in the economic sense of the word, not actually in the technical sense of the word. You
yes.
have sort of two of the major development platforms in a technology in the technology industry, which has about 7 or 8 major platforms in widespread use, and you saw basically what happens when sort of two of those platforms collide. Yes.
Yeah, so we've hit it pretty hard, but we'll just note for purposes of that slide that Google did clone the Java API to use as its own API for its own program, not to interoperate with the Java platform, and so they displaced the Java platform.
So this kind of brings us up to the types of APIs that a lot of the folks in our audience are thinking about and using, and really sort of where a lot of the API activity is happening these days, which is web APIs versus these Java APIs.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that we observed when we talked about this were that the Java code APIs are as system level APIs, they are very intricate. So sure, a lot of the conversation was hinging around things like math functions of calculating a maximum value, but there were a lot of other more interesting and complicated methods and so on, and the whole body of those, the way that they got organized together into classes and so on, formed a very unique
compiled
taxonomy.
into a taxonomy,
Exactly.
and Google used all of them
Exactly.
in the exact same order. Yes.
And so when we look at web APIs, a lot of the web APIs don't actually, so there definitely are complicated web APIs out there, but the majority of APIs don't necessarily rise to that same level of complexity. Now, of course, some people are like, well, I will also say, as a developer who's used many of these APIs, there are a number that do.
There's exceptions, right?
There are.
Typically, a
Yes.
web API is less complicated,
Well, what I would say
less
is,
highly structured.
so this is one of these ones where it'll be interesting to see, how this unfolds going forward. But there are a couple of things that we've observed. First of all, REST APIs definitely have certain structures to them. They're codified by the REST specification that looks for a certain organization of resources as plural nouns, sometimes in singular form, but generally part of the reason why people have converged around the REST API specification is that it is designed for developers to intentionally have a level of familiarity where they see that an API is expressed in a certain way, they can intrinsically understand what it's doing. So it does get into some of those method implementation merger type issues that
Yes,
you raised before.
It can drive separately created REST APIs to be similar to each other in structure.
In fact, if you've seen many of the conversations that we and others have done when we've talked about REST APIs, that's actually a goal for APIs that adhere to the REST conventions and REST specifications, is that they should actually start to look very, very similar. There will obviously be differences in the data payloads, and I think that will be things that get more interesting over time is how people go and describe those payloads. But the APIs themselves, the REST endpoints, there will be some level of convergence, even from completely independent types of development.
Yeah, and we should also talk about that in structuring your REST API when we get into some of the suggested practices. And then within the REST style, the resource names are common nouns, and it tells you to name that thing a common noun. If it's a dog, call it a dog.
Exactly.
Now you could call it a canine, I suppose.
I suppose you could, except that again, it's a sort of thing where you would be much more likely to have the types of, well, what I'm saying is I think this is part of why it raises the question, but I think that, and we'll talk about this in some of the subsequent slides a little bit more, it both raises the question of saying, do I have to call it canines versus dogs versus whatever, versus the fact that I actually think that people who are going in and creating REST APIs are going to probably be able to go and I'm not the lawyer, so I can make this statement. I think that they're going to be the ones who are going to be more likely to say, hey, that was the way that REST says I should name it.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, I actually think there's comfort to be taken in the Federal Circuit Court's decision, which was words that comprise names, and that's not actually the decision, that's copyright regulations,
yeah,
are not copyrightable. And again, talking about this specific case, Oracle versus Google, it was the use of all of the names, right. The complete compilation of the names that was a problem. Just wanted to note on the last point that the Oracle versus Google was not about using an API to access the operations or resources of the underlying program. And then moving into sort of suggested practices, when you think about using an API to interoperate with the underlying program for which the API was created, that's the purpose for which the API has been published. That's the purpose. There's language in the federal court's decision that honors this practice, makes it safe. And there are legal theories such as an implied license or an implied promise that you rely on, and there's community enforcement.
Yes.
Now we may see a rise maybe of more explicit licensing.
Well, and I hit advance on the slide too soon. Stacey was covering some of the points from the previous slide. But yeah, I think that does tee up some of the ways that people have discussed coping with this. One of the points I always make is it's not the end of the world that something is copyrightable. In fact, people, it's people in the free software movement, and actually the basis of open source, regardless of what licenses you use, whether you use the GPL, whether you use the Apache license, and so on. Many people are of the opinion that open source exists because code is copyrightable. Because it makes it possible to actually create a license for your work. If the code itself was not copyrightable, your only sharing software would be fraught with all sorts of challenges, and you could make things public domain and so on. But as has been raised in other forums, there's all sorts of issues and downside with that. So in many ways, the fact that code is copyrightable is why we have this flourishing open source community that we all benefit from. So copyright in and of itself, some people are like, oh, it's copyrightable, that's terrible. I go and say, well, what it does is actually just it gives us some rules by which we have to operate on, but it has certainly not been the end of the software industry. In fact, if anything, a lot of great innovation has happened because of that. That said, it does mean, me as a developer, I go and say, well, what does this mean? What should I do? And unfortunately, we're in a little bit of an in-between state because all the answers aren't here yet.
But if the analogy is the fact that APIs are copyrightable and that may increase the need for open source licenses,
well, that
sounds right, because when we talk about suggested practices, if you license an API, so first of all, suggested practices. One is you should avoid cloning APIs. That's essentially what the Oracle versus Google case was about. Cloning an API, using it as your own API, and displacing the underlying routines, resources, data of the underlying program for which the API was created.
So this goes to what the definition of cloning an API is, and I think that if what we've seen out of this whole decision, and again, I'm not the lawyer on this, but if I was trying to interpret this, I would say, well, what the definition of cloning the API was not about one specific method or one specific, if I was applying this to web APIs, one specific endpoint. It was the fact that it was an entire taxonomy of APIs. So if I had, if I've got my API and I have an endpoint that is similar to someone else's endpoint, that in itself is not going to be the source of the problem. The problem is going to be, do I have an entire set of endpoints organized in the same way that get used and invoked in the same processes, that take the same authentication mechanisms, that take the same data structures as inputs, that return the same data structures outputs, that use the same error codes,
as one other API.
Exactly,
in its
its entirety, and then I am doing so further for the purposes of not doing it for compatibility purposes, but as kind of a way to draw people away and perhaps cause economic detriment to the other person. That's sort of this cloning of an API scenario, and that type of thing. Should you find yourself in that, I actually think most developers don't find themselves in those settings, but if they do, then that's going to be the one where they probably need to talk to their lawyers and find out exactly whether they're because they're going to have a hard time going and saying oops to that one.
And I think it's also worth noting that if you're displacing the underlying program or underlying resources and supplying your own, or if you're violating a core standard, both of those things happened here. In addition to the very complete copying.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll do the shout out to one of my favorite TV shows, *Halt and Catch Fire*, last season, where they were dealing with cloning the BIOS in the original IBM PC and cloning the API. That was a whole story arc that was pretty interesting. Anyway.
So we suggest that you create your own APIs.
Yes, and I think one of the things that, again, if I were to think about what constituted being able to go and have a reasonable defense, if I was adhering to the RESTful, if I was adhering to something that was RESTful practices, I was using the typical naming conventions and so on. And another API was doing the same, and our APIs ended up looking similar. It sounds to me like the fact that we were both intentionally saying our APIs are RESTful APIs, and adhering to these REST conventions, that would sort of be the basis of a reasonable excuse as to why these APIs might look the same.
It might support the notion of the idea expression merger, that if there's only so many ways to express the underlying idea, because copyright law protects expression, not an idea. They don't protect ideas. I think also specifically with respect to the resource names, then you've got the law that words that comprise names are not copyrightable. So you've got both of those going for you. I think where you're creating your own APIs, you don't have to worry about exact copying. You have to worry, as you said, about the degree of similarity to another API, to one other API. If it's similar to a bunch of it's similar in one way to this API X, and it's similar in another way to API Y.
Yes.
So I just think it's helpful to be mindful of that. I know that in creating APIs, a lot of people will consult well-known APIs like the Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn API. So I think you just want to be mindful of that, of not wholesale copying.
I think that's probably
avoiding very exact similarity to one other API. In resource names, I'd love to know what you think, but I think, well, first of all, dog versus canine. Maybe you choose canine. It's still descriptive and it's a common noun.
I think if we're getting to that point, then that would be extremely worrisome if you start having to dig into your thesaurus every time you're naming your API. So I'm hoping, I certainly hope that doesn't end up being sort of the path we have to go down.
Well, there are no haves, but you know.
Yeah, exactly.
They're both descriptive. They're both common nouns.
Yes. I think one of the things that I find really interesting is the movement towards licensing of the APIs, and I think to a certain extent, I think that's the direction that a lot of that ultimately we probably will have to end up at, and I don't see that as the end of the world. In fact, you already see some movement towards this. Kin Lane, big leaders in the API movement, and an API evangelist, created the API Commons. That was, I think, a great starting point for this, and as a way for people to put their to license their APIs and to prevent this sort of thing. There is some discussion as to whether APIs need an Apache license or Apache style license, or whether something based off of Creative Commons is the right way to go. Mm-hmm. I think that these are the types of things that will be how we are able to put this behind us, because I think to the extent that there are licensed APIs, and to the extent that I think what will happen is, once we settle on ways to explicitly license our APIs, most API providers are not trying to go and build these walled gardens. What they're actually trying to do is get as many developers as possible to use APIs. And most developers, we've all been educated pretty well around the importance of licenses. When a developer goes to GitHub or goes to look at open source code, they actually shop the licenses.
Yes.
This is we've been a number of decades now into open source as a concept, and so people know to go and say, oh, I can use that code. Oh, that code has the Apache license. That's safe for me to use if I'm a business. Mm-hmm. Or I want to put this code out here, but I don't want people to be able to use it for this sort of thing. I'm going to choose this license. And the software industry has not been hampered by that. In fact, it's thrived because of that.
Yes.
And so I think our challenge right now is we're in a little bit of this sort of transitory gray area where we've been growing up with the assumption that APIs might not be, or probably were not copyrightable, and now we're seeing, there are going to be situations where their usage actually will be covered by copyright law, and that could be problematic. And so if we want to get into an area where the ambiguity is removed, this explicit license might be one way.
Yeah, and there may be a couple of flavors. I'm wondering if there might just develop a simple, hey, you can use my API to interop with my program.
Yes.
Make that safe for people. On the other end of the spectrum maybe is, do whatever the hell you want. I don't care if you displace my program. Maybe you have some standards that you implement there. But, I'd be proud if my API begat 1,000 derivative APIs.
Yeah, well,
then there's probably the proprietary in the middle, and that's where I would hope that people would be very simple, explanatory, and developer friendly.
I would agree. I think that what we'll see, again, I think that more right now it's more the case that people just don't know what the process is, and I think we will hopefully. We've already seen some of this conversation happening between various interested parties. Email threads and so on. People are like, hey, what license should we use for the APIs? And I think, hopefully we will see some convergence around that.
All right, so let's spend maybe about 5 minutes talking about situations. I think the discussion will be on somewhat of a general level, thinking about factors you should think about, and then we'll move on to the conclusion and questions. So one of the examples that might be worth discussing is if you're creating an API for a third-party program that doesn't have one.
And that's definitely an interesting one. Now, does that fall into this? This seems to be like this. How does that apply to any of what we've seen thus far? I mean, I understand how it's highly relevant in terms of it is an activity that we see happen quite a bit.
Right. But you're not copying someone else's API.
Right.
That's probably what you're pointing out. you're probably not even copying the underlying program.
Well, there's definitely an integration challenge. You are probably talking to an existing API that you may or may not be authorized to use. So in this one, the question I would have for you is just because this doesn't speak to that, wouldn't I still need to be concerned about things like terms of service the licensing usage for a piece of software, or reverse engineering law, or that sort of thing, if I'm trying to get into something and build an API?
Of course. That's an easy one. Now, the underlying program may have its own license.
Yes.
Right. The API may be a separate work. I think you're positing a situation where it has a private API.
Yes.
Yeah. The private API may be a separate work, may or may not be subject to the license of the underlying program. Then you'd have to think about how much of that private API is being copied in order that you can create your API. The situational factors, though, are sort of and the fair use factors are very favorable, right? Which is you're creating that to interoperate with the underlying platform. You're not displacing it. In fact, you're arguably increasing the market for that program.
So in that situation, it might be covered by other things, but in this particular, related to APIs, it's probably safe.
It's a lower risk, yeah.
So creating code for a third-party program, either with or without an API, or sort of ignoring or subverting the API. That sounds a little bit like the first one.
Yeah, I think they're actually pretty much the same. Yeah, I would say that there aren't appreciable differences. And then if there's questions on the phone on the differences or things in that area, we can get into that. I think when we're talking about all of these situations, as I was talking about with, for the first example, think about is someone else's API or the underlying program being either literally copied, or is it structure, sequence, or organization being copied? And then the situational aspect, what is the purpose for which the API or connecting code is being created? The Federal Circuit Court was both very clear that the interoperability was not before the court, but also that it's probably fair use, if not, and then there's probably some other things around the actual, whether it's protected by copyright if you're using it to interoperate.
So conclusions, and then let's jump into a couple of questions.
So the number one conclusion is the sky is not falling. We're not at Armageddon. It may sometimes feel that way. I think it just requires some thought and some awareness of some of these holdings and the situational aspects. The Oracle versus Google case did not change anything in terms of using APIs to access the operations and resources of the underlying program. I think the biggest issue coming out of the Oracle versus Google decision is in cloning an API to use as your own API and displacing something else, versus if you create your own API. The fair use decision in Oracle versus Google is coming later. I personally would not be surprised if Google loses that, because they were not trying to create interoperability with the Java platform. And their fair use defense is based on that.
So people probably shouldn't be holding out on that particular piece, just as sort of the next wait and see. Or they shouldn't be sort of potentially shocked when that happens. So I guess the things I would add to that are, as a developer who's trying to interpret what these things mean, you should be careful in being sort of drawn into kind of this, when these things get abstracted into sort of being these global issues. I think when I looked at this, in my, initial perspective, I was like, okay, there's very clearly Oracle and Google have an issue with each other. And it may or may not be a legitimate, well, it was a legitimate business disagreement. But a lot of people end up circling around this because it gets reduced down to sound bites. And so what I learned in reviewing this with you was that there were it wasn't as simple as this, the sky's falling APIs, like you can't use APIs type of scenario. There was actually quite a bit of it, and actually that copyright law is has actually dealt with a number of these issues before in both, first of all, actually in the technology space with code. These are actually
Yes.
issues that have been substantively reviewed and argued, and lots of actual smart, knowledgeable people about the subject domain have been involved and consulted and so on. So it's fascinating to see every time I get the opportunity to look in on some of these things. But probably more, to the point, you always have to sort of, really ask
Peel
for
it
the hard.
back.
You got to peel
Yeah.
back before you assume that it's going to go and suddenly change the way that or most developers who are dealing with these things are going to be impacted.
That's great, and hopefully we've helped those of you attending this webinar peel it back a little bit.
We will wrap this up. For those who have been listening in, thanks a lot. Hopefully you learned some interesting things from this. I know that we did while preparing for this, and hopefully you all join us for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.